In many ways, the history of the United Kingdom is the history of the monarchy, and on September 8th, 2022, the world saw what it had not seen for 70 years and 214 days: a new British monarch. Charles III became the oldest man ever to ascend to the British throne. But while this particular succession might be something of a novelty, in the past succession has been sometimes, more contentious, leading sometimes to years of conflict, and at other times seeming to turn on twists of chance. In an odd twist, 115 years before Elizabeth II, the daughter of the fourth son of the king, who himself had never been a king, was crowned queen. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Elizabeth and Charles's reign itself can be said to have been something of a surprise. When he was born, Elizabeth's father, Albert, was not the oldest, but the second son of the Prince of Wales, the future King George V. It was generally assumed that his older brother, the future Edward VIII, would be king, but things often don't work out as expected, and in this case, in a way that was even more unexpected. Edward indeed ascended to the throne when his father died in 1936, but not only did he fail to produce an heir, he made the startling choice to abdicate his throne in order to marry a twice-divorced American. Quite to the surprise of the nation, Albert Frederick Arthur George became King George VI, followed by his daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, and grandson, King Charles III. But in many ways, the ascension of another queen was more surprising than that of George VI, and that all started with George III. George III was of the House of Hanover. The Hanoverian dynasty was the result of the 1701 Act of Settlement, which settled the line of succession on Protestants only. Following the death of the last monarch of the Stuart dynasty, Queen Anne, in 1707, the act, by excluding any person who was either Catholic or married to a Catholic, passed over at least 6 living people closer to kinship to Anne than the one eventually chosen, George I. The new line were the descendants of Sophie of Hanover, granddaughter of James I. And if that all seems confusing, you're starting to get the point. George III had an exceptionally long reign, becoming King of Great Britain and Ireland on October 26, 1760. He was king when the kingdoms were united on January 1st, 1801, making him the first king of the United Kingdom, and ruling until his death on January 29, 1820. His 60-year reign made him the longest-reigning king in British history. It was, of course, an interesting reign, which included the American War for Independence, the Napoleonic Wars, and the banning of the transatlantic slave trade. But his reign is now perhaps most remembered for his mental illness, which manifested for the first time possibly as early as 1765, and for which there has been no definitive diagnosis. And while analyses of the success of the rule of George III sometimes disagree with each other, one thing is certain. He did not have difficulty producing heirs with his wife of 57 years, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. He proved, if nothing else, through his mere fecundity, his commitment to preserving the British crown. George III's oldest son was also named George and born August 12, 1762. A second son, Frederick, was born almost exactly a year later, on August 16th. William Henry was born in August 1765, Charlotte in September 1766, Edward in November 1767, Augusta Sophia in November 1768, Elizabeth in May of 1770, Ernest Augustus in June of 1771, Augustus in January 1773, Adolphus in February 1774, Mary in April 1776, Sophia in November 1777, Octavius in February 1779, Alfred in September 1780, and Amelia in August 1783. That's correct. Queen Charlotte produced 15 children in 21 years. The tragedy came with their later children. Octavius, Alfred, and Amelia all predeceased the king and queen. Alfred died before reaching the age of 2, and Octavius at age 4, both from illnesses after being inoculated against smallpox. Both deaths were a shock, as the children had previously been healthy. Prior to Edward Jenner's vaccine, people were inoculated against smallpox using a mild form of the disease, but still 1% to 2% died from that weakened form. Amelia, always sickly, died after a bout of measles on November 2nd, 1810, at the age of 27. Still, 12 surviving children would seem to have been enough to preserve the royal line. But it wasn't enough simply to preserve the line. You also had to preserve the status of the royal house. In 1771, George III's brother, Prince Henry, Duke of Cumberland and Strathearn, married a commoner named Ian Horton. The king thought the marriage was unsuitable and diminished the crown. Thus he suggested to Parliament the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. In brief, the act stipulated that any descendant of George II must secure approval of the reigning monarch, signified under the Great Seal and declared in council, in order to marry. Any marriage not so approved would be invalid, and any children of such marriages not in the line of succession to the throne. Spurred by his brother's marriage, the act would have a huge impact on George's own children and grandchildren, the next two generations of monarchs. George III's bouts of insanity became more of a serious problem in 1788, and Parliament began discussions of giving his son George, the Prince of Wales, limited power under a Regency Act, although the king recovered before one was passed. He would eventually be granted a regency with limited power when his father's illness relapsed in 1810. In contrast to his father, the younger George was given to scandal, a wastrel who was chronically in debt. In 1785, he contracted marriage with a commoner, Mary Fitzhubert, but the marriage was illegal. He did not obtain or even apparently seek the king's consent to marry. No children are known to have come from their relationship, but any would not have been considered legitimate and thus not be heirs to the throne. Instead, he was pressured to marry Caroline of Brunswick, his first cousin, in 1795. It was an unhappy marriage, but it produced a daughter, Princess Charlotte, born in January 1796. As her father was Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, Charlotte became second in line to the throne of England. On May 2nd, 1816, to the delight of the Prince Regent and the British public, the 20-year-old princess married a nobleman from the Saxon Duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, Leopold. The princess quickly became pregnant, but suffered first a miscarriage, and then, on November 5th, 1817, delivered a stillborn boy. Charlotte suffered complications, and she died the next day. The kingdom mourned. But the problem was even deeper than the death of a beloved royal. Her father, the Prince Regent, was 55 years old. He had no other children, and he was estranged from his wife. He was obese and possibly addicted to laudanum. George proved unable to obtain a divorce, even after he ascended to the throne after his father's death in 1820. An attempt to move an act through Parliament proved unpopular with the public and failed. George IV and his queen consort were estranged, but could not be divorced. As long as Caroline lived, he could have no more legitimate children. The Prince Regent would have no heir. But perhaps even more surprising, despite having 12 surviving children in their 40s and 50s, he did not have a single living legitimate grandchild. His 5 daughters were all beyond childbearing age, and yet had produced no offspring. His second son, Frederick, the Duke of York, a military officer now second in line for the throne, was married to a Prussian princess, but it was another poor match, and the two had no children. They were estranged, although amicably, and in any case, she was also beyond childbearing age. 4 of the 5 remaining sons were still unmarried, while Augustus, the Duke of Sussex, was married, but the marriage was not valid under the Royal Marriages Act. With both the Prince Regent and the Duke of York mired in estranged marriages, focus fell on the next oldest son, 52-year-old William Henry, Duke of Clarence and St. Andrews. William had served with the Royal Navy, including serving in New York during the American Revolution, the only member of the royal family to visit the Americas during the Revolution. As a third son, William Henry had never been expected, nor apparently expected himself, to inherit the throne, and so the Duke had settled into domestic life with an Irish actress named Dorothea Bland. The couple apparently enjoyed a degree of domestic bliss, and the coupling had produced 10 children between 1794 and 1807. But while George III accepted the relationship, the twice-divorced actress was certainly not suitable for marriage. She was a mistress. The two never married, and the 10 children, all grandchildren of the king, could not be in the line of succession. Dorothea died in 1816. Now the Duke, who never expected to inherit the throne, was third in the line of succession, and of the 3 oldest brothers, by far the most healthy. He now was not only likely to eventually inherit the throne, but had the greatest possibility of siring the next monarch. A suitable match was found in 26-year-old Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. The pairing received royal assent, and the two married on July 11th, 1818. Despite the difference in their ages, their marriage seems to have been a happy one and produced 5 children. But none would be a monarch. 3 were stillborn, and the remaining 2 died in infancy. While there were occasional rumors of other pregnancies, no other children came from the marriage. If William had never been expected to inherit the throne, certainly Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, never faced the expectation. An army officer who had spent years in Canada after the death of Princess Charlotte in 1817, he, like his brothers, hurried to marry in the hopes of producing an heir. The 50-year-old prince married yet another German princess, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a widow 18 years his junior and sister of Princess Charlotte's husband, Leopold. They married May 29, 1818. The marriage produced just a single child, a daughter named after her mother. But Edward died suddenly of pneumonia in January 1820, and 6 days later, the venerable King George III finally passed away on January 29th. The Prince Regent became King George IV, ruling for a decade until his death June 26, 1830. Frederick had died in 1827, so the crown passed to William Henry, who ruled as William IV. George III's next oldest child, Charlotte, the Princess Royal, had passed away in 1828. And as William, despite having 10 children, had no surviving legitimate heirs, the next in line was the only child of the 4th son and 5th child of George III, the deceased Duke of Kent. When William IV passed away in June 1837, 18-year-old Princess Alexandrina Victoria of Kent ascended to the throne of the United Kingdom. Queen Victoria ruled for the next 67 years, during one of the most dynamic periods in the history of the British Empire, the single longest reigning British monarch before Elizabeth II. But there was one more twist for the children of George III. While Victoria became the Queen of the United Kingdom, since she was a woman, she was barred from ascending to the throne of the Kingdom of Hanover. Thus, Ernest Augustus, the 5th son and 8th child of George III, became King of Hanover. Thus ended the 123-year personal union between the United Kingdom and Hanover. He had one child with his wife, Frederica Louise Caroline Sophie Alexandrina of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who would become King George V of Hanover, but was behind Victoria in the line of succession for the British throne. Finally, Adolphus, George III's 7th son and 10th child, also fathered legitimate children. His granddaughter was Mary of Teck, who married George V of England and was Elizabeth II's grandmother. It all seems a rather obscure path to the throne for the great-great-great-grandmother of the new king of the United Kingdom. But Victoria's 9 children became so intermarried throughout the royal families of Europe that in her time she was called the Grandmother of Europe. Not only is the new king of the United Kingdom, Charles III, her direct descendant, but so is the current king of Norway, Harold V, and the queen of Denmark, Margaretha II, and the king of Spain, Philippe VI. During the Great War, both the king of the United Kingdom, George V, and the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, were grandchildren of Queen Victoria, as was the wife of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. And yet for all these royal descendants, the queen herself was never the child of a king or a queen. That is history that deserves to be remembered in the coming months as we witness both a royal funeral and a coronation. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.